Good morning. I'm Chris Hayes in New York. If you missed our first hour, check your DVR because we had an Up exclusive this morning. A memo from a Washington lobbying firm pitching an attack on Occupy Wall Street and Democratic politicians sympathetic to Occupy Wall Street. Joining me now to talk about that story and the day's other political news is senior advisor to the President Obama's campaign and former White House communications director Anita Dunn. Anita, thanks so much for joining us. I really appreciate it.
Good morning, Chris, and thank you for having me on this morning.
So I think you saw the story that we were just talking about, the memo we obtained from a lobbying firm with two partners of which used to work for Speaker John Boehner. I'll read you a quote from it, and I want to get your reaction. The memo says it shouldn't be surprising that the Democratic Party or even President Obama's re-election team would campaign against Wall Street in the cycle. However, the bigger concern should be that Republicans will no longer defend Wall Street companies and might start running against them, too. What do you make of that?
Well, boy, that is a scary prospect, isn't it, Chris? I have to say, having watched the first hour of your show, that I thought there was a story on the front page of the New York Times this morning that actually provides a kind of nice complement to it, which is the story about the Wall Street donors rallying behind Scott Brown against Elizabeth Warren and the extraordinary support that they're showing him. And they actually use in the headline the phrase vilifying his opponent, which I think is true. And I think if you actually look at what's been going on in that Massachusetts Senate race, you'll see some of the tactics that the memo that you've been discussing this morning talked about in terms of Occupy Wall Street being used. Crossroads GPS, which is, of course, the large Karl Rove-backed so-called super PAC, has been running ads up there using a lot of those themes in terms of, vilifying Occupy Wall Street, Elizabeth Warren. It's a threat to, American democracy. Nobody should think that this is going to be easy. It wasn't easy for the president to get financial reform legislation passed that would do common sense things. Common sense things like making sure that when you sign a mortgage, you understand what you're signing. Common sense things like making sure that banks can't make huge, risky, speculative bets using money that's been deposited by people. I mean, those are common sense things. Those are rules that I think make the system fairer for everyone. And the battle that the president had to fight to get that passed was extraordinary. And the fact that every single one of the Republican candidates for president has as one of their top job creators the repeal of those common sense reforms tells you something about politics today.
Well, one of the things I think is interesting in the memo as well is that it views this in fairly squarely partisan terms. That the threat of Democratic victories in 2012 on the sort of strengthened by the Occupy Wall Street sentiment that being channeled is that we'll see further reforms of Wall Street, or that Republican politicians will run against and will actually convert to policy. At the same time, the critique of the president, not just from progressives, but I think, John Boehner's spokesperson talking about the president raising a lot of money from Wall Street, is that the president himself is too close to Wall Street and Wall Street interests. What is your response to that?
Well, I would say if that is, if that's the case, then why were these tough reforms passed over party line Republican opposition?
Right.
Why are they refusing to allow the president to actually, nominate and get confirmed the head of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau? I think that's ridiculous. Another story this morning that I think is worth looking at is the fact that the president's re-election campaign is being fueled, the majority of it, by small donors. And people are, quote, surprised by that. Well, you shouldn't be surprised by that. People in this country understand that the president's values about responsibility, about accountability, about fairness are the ones that really are the traditional American values we need to get back to in our economy and in how we move forward together. That we're all in this together, that there isn't some small, secret, special group of people who somehow don't have to sacrifice as the rest of us do. And I think that is a core difference in this campaign, and one that the American people are seeing. It's why the Republicans are so scared of the Occupy Wall Street sentiments, because it's given voice to this idea that there are these growing inequalities. I mean, heck, Paul Ryan made a speech about income inequality recently.
Right.
Now, what does that tell you?
I'm glad you raised the issue of the re-election campaign, because one of the things that strikes me is a lot of the a lot of the sort of grassroots energy that the president was able to marshal in 2008 as an insurgent, as an underdog, particularly in the beginning of the campaign, a lot of that energy we've seen, I think, in some ways channeled into Occupy Wall Street right now. And we've heard stories in my own reporting. There was a story in the New York Times about sort of disillusionment among young people or a lack of energy. What do you see as the sort of challenges that face re-election and the differences between running this race in 2012 as an incumbent president than 2008 when it was this sort of insurgent movement?
Well, obviously every race is unique and every race is different. For 3 years, this country has been, living with the aftermath of the policies that created the greatest financial crisis and recession that we've had since the Great Depression. And we're all in it together, which has been a huge part of the president's message, and we're all going to get out of it together by building an economy that's built to last this time, not going from bubble to bubble. But listen, this election at the end of the day is going to be a choice. And I think that if you look at the number of small donors, if you look at the people who are starting to sign up to volunteer, to say, yes, there really is a choice this time, and it's a fundamental choice about what kind of America we're going to be in the future. We're a year out from the election, Chris. I think that a lot of people right now are saying, I'm going to wait until it really makes a difference. Over the next year, it's going to make a difference. If you look at the amount of money that the other side is going to have, and I think that your story this morning about the lobbying effort against Occupy Wall Street, as well as the story of the amount of money being poured into Scott Brown's campaign, as well as any story about how much money Crossroads GPS or any of the other Republican super PACs are raising, tells you what the stakes are in this election. It is the small number of people who feel like they should be able to write the rules to benefit themselves against the 99. And I think that this is a case where the rest of us are going to get together and say, the stakes are too high to sit home. And I think you see that with the small donations to the president's campaign. Over half of those people are new donors from last time.
That's interesting. You just mentioned Crossroads GPS, which is an outside group. It's run by Karl Rove. It's raised a lot of money. It's bought a lot of paid media already in its short life. It's run things in swing states, in Wisconsin. Last time around, the president's campaign directed Democratic donors and outside groups to not prop up outside groups that were chartered under a whole variety of legal terminology, 527, super PACs, etc. This time around, we are seeing groups like that, Priorities USA, which I believe Bill Burton, who used to work in the White House, is now working at. Is this just a sort of acknowledgement to the reality of how broken the campaign finance system is in the wake of Citizens United, that you just can no longer toe the line against having outside groups?
Chris, you articulated it beautifully. The Supreme Court basically said, let's open the floodgates here. And I think that, unfortunately, that is the world in which we live right now. It's one of the reasons why the small donations to the president's campaign, the people across the country who are sending $10 or $25, who aren't the big donors, who aren't the people who can hire the lobbyists and write the rules, right? Those people are getting behind the president's campaign, and they are, at the end of the day, the best defense against the big donors who are funding the Republican campaigns. I will say this, though. There's no doubt that we need fundamental reform in this country. Next year will mark the 10-year anniversary of McCain-Feingold, and look at where we are now. So I think that it's a challenge for all of us progressives to figure out, how do we fix this system?
The president's approval ratings have edged up recently, and we tend to, I think, obsess a little bit about the approval ratings from day to day because that it's very messy data. Lord knows what's happening in a given tracking poll, but the president's approval ratings have gone up recently. We have some polling here. I think this is the job approval rating rise, and this is a 5-point spread disapproval before the introduction of the American Jobs Act. According to Pew, and since then we have him tied at 46 approve, 46% disapprove. It looks like the tactic the president has taken, which was the first time in his presidency to do something that a lot of people have urged him to do earlier, which was to actually craft legislation, give it to Congress, and ask Congress and push Congress to pass it, to go out and campaign and stump in its favor. This is a way of approaching the legislative process that people have called for since the very beginning. The president did not take in a bunch of signature legislative efforts. He has with the American Jobs Act. Is this a model for the next 14 months, I guess 12 months at this point, going into the election?
Well, Chris, this country has a tremendous challenge when it comes to its economy. There are millions of people across the country who don't have jobs, who want to work, who are looking for jobs, who are still feeling the effects of the crash from 2008. And the fact that the Republicans in Congress won't get behind proposals that they themselves have backed in the past really tells you a great deal about what their true agenda is. I think that the president sent to Congress a common sense package of proposals that will create jobs in September, and that he will continue to press Congress, as he has, to pass these things and get people back to work, to start building the foundation for an economy that will last, not an economy that goes from bubble to bubble, and one where hard work is rewarded and responsibility is recognized. I think that that is a huge contrast with the Republican field, but it's also the right thing to do. And frankly, if you look at Congress's approval ratings right now, and particularly Republicans in Congress, it's almost like they're trying to see if they can do get down to single digits, and I think in recent polls they have in some places. You would think that they would listen to the American people, too, who say, let's have some balance, let's attack these issues, but above all, let's look for results, solutions, and get people back to work. But they're not listening, and the question is whether they start listening before 2012. The president is going to keep pushing because that's what he needs to do in order to get people back to work.
We saw polling data. Someone put a chart together of things more popular than Congress in the United States, and America Going Communist had higher approval ratings than the United States Congress. Anita Dunn.
God, don't tell the people at Fox, okay?
Yes. Anita Dunn, senior advisor to President Obama's campaign, former White House communications director. Thanks so much for joining us. I hope you'll come back.
Oh, thank you, Chris. I hope you'll have me.
All right, my other guests return to tackle Newtmentum when we return. For joining me at the table this morning, we have James Polis of thedailycaller.com, MSNBC contributor Melissa Harris Perry, Michelle Goldberg from Newsweek, and Laura Flanders from Grit TV. All right, so on Monday, Newt Gingrich was introduced at an event in Iowa as the top GOP contender. The merry-go-round continues to circle. 2 days later on Wednesday, Bloomberg News, and I just want to take a second to give a hat tip to Bloomberg on this. This was fantastic reporting by their reporters. They reported that Newt Gingrich was paid at least $1.6 million by Freddie Mac from 1997 to 2007. We had thought formerly it was just $300,000. At one point, I love this detail. At one point, Gingrich was paid a self-renewing monthly retainer of $25,000 to $30,000 a month. And I love the term self-renewing. It's like, oh, look at that, April 30th. Let's just re-up that bad boy.
Chris, don't hate the player.
That is true. That's the motto of don't hate the player, hate the game. So what's so interesting about this to me is that, Freddie Mac and its larger cousin Fannie Mae have been super unpopular with Republicans. In fact, Republicans faced with this financial crisis had a kind of ideological challenge, which is you have this collapse of tremendous market failure, right? But you can't quite ideologically say, well, financial capitalism is in ruins, it immolated. You have to find a government culprit. And so what happened was a story was reverse engineered to create Fannie and Freddie as the culprits of the housing bubble, in defiance of the data, which, James, if you want to talk about, I will happily go back and forth on you on. And so what's interesting to me first are the political ramifications. Here's Gingrich's now sort of iconic response to being asked about Fannie and Freddie at the debate by John Harwood, and him giving his explanation of just what he was doing for Fannie and Freddie. Here he is.
Were you not trying to help Freddie Mac fend off the effort by the Bush administration?
No, I do. No, I do. I have never done it. I have never done
Freddie Mac.
I assume I get a second question. I have never done any lobbying. Every contract that was written during the period when I was out of the office specifically said I would do no lobbying, and I offered advice. And my advice as a historian, when they walked in and said to me, we are now making loans to people who have no credit history, and have no record of paying back anything, but that's what the government wants us to do. As I said to them at the time, this is a bubble. This is insane. This is impossible.
Sources inside Freddie Mac say that's not true, that, in fact, he did not warn them. He did not consult Plutarch's opinion on subprime lending, as he seems to be intimating there. I want to go to you first, James, because I'm curious just to talk about this politically for a second. I think Rick Perry was really damaged early on in his campaign to be the anti-Romney by the very effective Bachmann attacks on him from the right. And it was on the HPV virus, and it was on and Romney's attack on immigration. Do you think this will hurt Newt on his right flank, given the role that Fannie and Freddie play in the sort of conservative imagination?
Okay, let's skip through these things quickly. First, about Fannie and Freddie. The implication of your remark is that the financial system fell apart all on its own. Government was not involved. Andrew Cuomo was not at fault. Howell Raines was not at fault. Rahm Emanuel is not at fault. The list goes on. Is that right in your estimate?
My contention is this on the housing bubble specifically. The housing bubble was driven by private market forces, not by government incentives. And in fact, if you look at the period where the housing bubble takes off, which is around 2002 and 2003, it was precisely at the moment that Fannie and Freddie's share of the market plummeted from 50% down to about 20%. The private securitization had much higher default rates, was driving all the subprime lending. So Fannie and Freddie are totally corrupt in all sorts of terrible ways, and really awful entities in a whole bunch of ways, and we're spreading money all around Washington. But they are not the cause of the housing bubble and the subsequent catastrophe. That's my contention. Okay. But to the politics of Newt Gingrich.
I think you're right that Perry was hurt very badly coming out of the gate. I do not think that Michelle Bachmann's attacks on him were very effective. I think they blew back in her face. But I do think the immigration thing did hurt him. I think that was largely his own fault. When you tell your own constituents
they don't have a heart,
they're heartless, then they are going to respond in kind. Newt Gingrich, right? What a man. In any other race, this Fannie-Freddie thing, I think, would be tremendously damaging to him, disqualifying. But we're in a very special race right now. And it may just be that there's no one else who can make as solid of a case that he's the last anti-Mitt standing. Mitt talks about the weeds. Mitt talks about policy. Mitt wants to bracket the whole conversation about sort of the future of Western civilization and whether or not our culture is in peril writ large. And that's Newt's bread and butter. He can also talk wonk like Mitt can, but it's a one-way street. Yeah, Mitt can't compete with Newt when it comes to talking about the future of humanity.
And this goes beyond, this goes beyond just Fannie and Freddie, because it's also been revealed that Newt was lobbying on behalf of a healthcare mandate, on behalf of
Medicare Part D. Right. Tim Carney had great reporting in the Washington Examiner.
Advanced care directives, kind of known in the conservative argot as death panels. And so, and in a way, maybe that ends up helping Romney, because it makes it clear, what's always been clear to people who kind of follow these things, is that these healthcare plans that are now, or healthcare reform, which is now being decried as, kind of tyrannical socialism, actually had its origins in the Heritage Foundation and in a lot of conservative ideas espoused by people like Newt Gingrich.
Right, but the question is, Newt is not tied to them in the same way Romney is. Melissa would...
Yeah, in the end, and it is an odd race, and it's been so much fun, and I weep daily that Herman Cain is no longer the front runner of the GOP. But, in the end, I think that it will be less about these ideological battles, as important as they seem like they are at the moment. It's going to be about who Republican primary voters think is most likely to defeat President Obama in the fall. Yeah. And if Newt can make that claim, then he'll be the nominee. And if Mitt Romney can make that claim, ultimately, for all the wrangling that's going on at the moment, once they start caucusing and voting, the question is going to be who looks like they can beat the president.
It really comes down to which is more prevalent inside Republican circles, Obama hate or Mormon hate, because that's really what it's coming. The fact
you really think that?
Well, the fact that Newt's candidacy is at where it is today, I think, is extraordinary. And just on this question of Fannie and Freddie for just a second.
Please, we'll talk about Fannie and Freddie all morning.
Stories come up and they become sort of election, horse race stories. But the key to the Fannie and Freddie story is not that they brought down the financial industry. It's that they modeled how to control the controllers. Throughout the 90s, after the savings and loans, Gretchen Morgenson writes about it. We talked about this with her on the show. After savings and loans, the effort to require financial agencies, including, first and foremost, Fannie and Freddie, a kind of quasi-government group, to have capital to support their loans. it was serious. It was a serious drive that was killed by this money that was spread around. So in that sense of buying off the regulators, Fannie and Freddie, what they modeled was critical. And sure, it's dirt on Newt Gingrich now, but it is a lot of people who lost their homes.
Right, and I think you see it's part of the sort of economy of influence in Washington that is sort of a broad and emerging theme. I want to talk more about that, and I want to play some of Newt's greatest hits on his thoughts on Fannie and Freddie when we come back.
I think Senator McCain should have turned and said, Senator Obama, are you prepared to give back all the money that Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae gave to you? Are you prepared to fire your housing advisor who was paid $90 million over 6 years while helping ruin Fannie Mae? Are you prepared to fire your advisor who was the former head of Fannie Mae, Mr. Johnson? Are you prepared to disassociate yourself from Chris Dodd, who was the highest recipient of money from Fannie Mae? I think compared, for example, to Senator Chris Dodd taking a below-market interest mortgage from Countrywide before it went broke, or compared to Chris Dodd and Barack Obama being the number 1 and 2 recipients of money from Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac while they were going broke, I think it's pretty hard to argue that a family feud is a big scandal.
That is former House Speaker Newt Gingrich circa 2008, basically making a strong, passionate case that taking any money from Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac is totally reprehensible and corrupting, and it should be the top of everyone's mind when talking about these things. I am just amazed by the fact that Newt Gingrich is in this position, partly because I think I have this idea that part of what the frustration is on the right and the sort of Tea Party driving is crony capitalism, is special interest self-dealing, that is something that we on the left and on the right can sort of unite around. If they nominate Newt Gingrich, that to me makes me think that actually isn't what's going on. That's not a concern, because here is someone who just could not be more of a creature of that same morally bankrupt establishment, right? Tell me I'm right, James.
You know, Newt's one of these guys who seems to have these rebirths here because there's just something about Newt, and he could have this rebirth here of Napoleonic proportions. When Nietzsche was writing about Napoleon, he said, you know, Napoleon had this great moment when his wife was accusing him of infidelity, and he said, "I have the right to answer all accusations against me with an eternal 'that's me.'" And that's Newt. Said, you know,
that's a great line.
Oh, I was couch cuddling with Nancy Pelosi. That was stupid. Next question. Right. And I think there's this kind of weird way in which people say, like, yes, we want to see this guy who came in at the forefront of the Republican Revolution in '94, was a soldier for the movement, fell from grace, sort of went down into the crevasse and was covered in slime, and now we can maybe pull him out again.
And the will do almost anything for money. I mean, that makes him
but I mean, the other thing, you know, we talked earlier about, you know, the Republicans on Law and Order, but the other thing they're really big on is nostalgia. And so both kind of long-term nostalgia, the idea that there was once this America where things were great and if only we could reclaim that America, but also specifically partisan nostalgia, whether it is the revival and revision of Reagan and sort of who Reagan is, but there is potentially a sort of Newt Gingrich nostalgia that could emerge around here.
And he's tried to tout, you know, one of his sort of main talking points, sort of substantively, is that the balanced budget and the economic surplus of the 90s were his doing, right? I mean, that's one of the things he has come to sort of own. And in terms of the Newt grandiosity, which is a topic I find endlessly fascinating, because he has an amazing character study. This is a quote that I had never encountered before until James's column about Newt and Mitt Romney, which I think was in the Daily Caller. This is him writing notes to himself in advance of giving a talk at GoPac, talking about who Newt is and what Newt's role is. Do I have this? Maybe I don't have this.
But is it like I'm Pat from Saturday Night
No,
Live?
here it is. I have it.
I'm kind enough and people like me.
No,
here it is. It's advocate of civilization, defender of civilization, teacher of the rules of civilization, arouser of those who form civilization, organizer of the pro-civilization activists, and leader, possibly, of the civilizing forces.
This is hilarious. hilarious, but this is also, I think, kind of the key to his appeal to people who do believe we're in a kind of existential battle for Christendom and who do see politics in these kind of apocalyptic terms, which I think underlies a great deal of both the Christian right critique and the Tea Party critique. That beyond kind of issues of crony capitalism or beyond health care, the real issue is that the forces of darkness are besieging the city on a hill that is America, and kind of only Newt understands the big picture.
And Mitt Romney is very bad at big picture.
But he has ABBA as his cell phone ring. I mean, is that going to get away with it?
I wish we had that sound.
How can you be the defender of civilization when you...
It's revealing, though, that he's talking in civilizational terms. He's not saying, I'm Michelle Bachmann, defender of Christendom. He's not saying, God wants us to win this. He's talking in these very, in this... if I can use the phrase big tent, to describe the ultimate big tent of civilization itself. Right? And I think that, when you stack it up, again, against what Mitt Romney is selling, really strikes a chord with people who want to see a kind of great man kind of figure come into this race in the Republican Party. The Paul Ryans of the world not playing ball this time around.
And it's also
going to fill that role. Not Herman Cain, like him or not.
And it's also been fascinating to see the way that, because you said the civilizational rhetoric is somewhat secular, but it also is a kind of dog whistle to people who see this stuff in kind of theological terms.
Well, there's room for them to
and it's been fascinating to see some of the evangelicals slowly accommodate themselves to Newt Gingrich as a potential standard bearer for family values.
Because he has so many wives.
He said a lot of families. What I also find really interesting about the civilizing is that this could be, particularly if Tea Party and Occupy find a way to find points of contact and to really be collectively the pushback. The other side of that is not just the 1%, sort of economically. It's a personality that we would call sort of authoritarianism, right? And it's just, and that's kind of a rough term politically, but it just means people who prefer order and prefer structure and are really find it a very anxious and upsetting situation when you can't predict what's going to happen. And so they will take predictability, even if it's predictable inequality, over the kind of disruption.
I think that's a great point. And here's Newt Gingrich. I want to go out on Newt Gingrich making exactly this case, tying it all together in talking about Occupy Wall Street. We'll take a look at this, go to break, and come right back.
The destructive, hostile, anti-civilization behaviors of the so-called Occupy Wall Street crowd. They want to tear down our country. We love our country, and we want to rebuild our country.
Lady Gaga singing "You and I," a song I like so much. I taught myself to play it on the guitar. Maybe someday I'll do an up rendition. Props to my senior producer Kim Harvey, who just hooked me up with the quote in the teleprompter as I was fishing around. Well done, Kim. Thank you very much. All right. Some of the big names on tomorrow's Sunday Talkers include Senators John Kyle, John Kerry, and Pat Toomey, Congressman Jeb Hensarling and Xavier Becerra, who are all super committee members. Republican presidential candidate Ron Paul will also be out there. We got you guys a list of the others as well. So, James Polis, what would you ask of whom if you were on the Sunday talk shows?
So here's my question for Toomey, the Tea Party guy on the super committee, who is getting slammed for actually daring to put forward a package that raises net revenues, the margins. How could this happen? I thought this was the crazy Tea Party guy who doesn't want to raise, revenues at all. I thought that's what the Tea Party is all about. Wrong. The Tea Partiers are the ones in the Republican Party who actually have an interest in bumping up revenues a little bit if you go to the root of the problem, which is changing the tax code. Question is, Toomey, why is it that establishment Republicans in Congress don't understand what guys like Ron Paul and Rick Perry and John Huntsman across the board in the primary field understand, which is if you want to solve the deficit problem, if you want to deal with revenues, you got to go straight at that tax code, rip it up and start over.
Michelle Goldberg, what would you ask on the Sunday shows?
Well, throughout the debates, we keep hearing all the candidates attack Obama for not fulsomely supporting the opposition in Iran, who some of the candidates have referred to as the insurgents in Iran.
Right.
I would like to ask Condoleezza Rice whether she thinks that this attempt of the American right to associate itself with this with the Iranian opposition is dangerous to the Iranian opposition, who has so far been very clear that they do not want public and active American support.
Why is that the case? I mean, the idea being that they will be tainted fundamentally.
Yeah, I mean,
domestically.
the main kind of rhetorical cudgel against the Iranian opposition is that they are American puppets, as opposed to, kind of patriotic reformers. And it seems as if the Republican field has done everything in their power to prop up that interpretation. I would love to see Condoleezza Rice, who I think has a kind of genuine understanding of the situation, talk about whether or not they are actually hurting the people that ostensibly they want to help.
It sure wouldn't help Occupy Wall Street if Al-Zawahiri came out with a statement in favor of what they were doing. Laura Flanders, what do you want to ask?
Two questions. I mean, for the super committee members, I think I would like them to simply turn to the camera and apologize to the American people for having run this deficit con job hostage-taking all summer. And are we all supposed to really just say, okay, well, that's fine, no big deal, and we understand you're going to roll back the defense cuts before this next opportunity comes around? I mean, I think it's an insult, and I think people are furious. And then the last thing I would say is, I would ask any of them, are they willing to give up their seat at the table and allow some Occupy Wall Street person to actually sit there and speak for themselves?
I will tell you, they will say no.
Give you that.
Next question. Yeah, I will speak for Xavier Becerra, John Kerry, John Kyle. Melissa Harris Perry, what would you ask on the Sunday show?
Well, I'm actually interested in talking to Ron Paul about Occupy Wall Street, and particularly about state action, local government action over and against the right to assemble. I always find Paul fascinating in the ways that he thinks about civil liberties, the ways that he thinks about the Constitution. Not always clearly, not always in agreement with my positions on these things, but I always find it enlightening to hear Paul sort of discuss and think about what exactly our freedoms are that the Constitution protects. And I'd be interested to hear what he thinks about state action against
That would be a great discussion. Congressman Ron Paul, if you happen to be watching, or any of your staffers, I would love to have you on Up with Chris Hayes to have precisely that conversation. All right, so what do we know now we didn't know last week? My answer's after this. In just a second, I'll tell you what I didn't know when the week began, but right now it's time for a preview of Weekends with Alex Witt. Alex, what's coming up this morning?
Well, let me get to that with you, Chris. We have Capitol Hill countdown. If the super committee fails, what happens next? Just 5 days left. Members are on the Hill this morning. Will they beat that clock? And speaking of clocks, the debt clock keeps ticking. It's about $15 trillion now. We're going to look at possible solutions to this growing problem. Here's the question. Are there any? And a new and mysterious twist in the Natalie Wood case. We know the investigation into her death is now reopened, but why would one person close to the situation decide to hire a lawyer? And Chris, better not stray too far from the studio. We're going to see you at 9:30 a.m. with more on your Occupy Wall Street exclusive. We're looking forward to that.
I am too. Thanks, Alex. So what do we know now that we didn't know last week? Well, we know that with the forcible eviction of its tents, tarps, and encampments, not to mention the trashing of thousands of its books, the first chapter of Occupy Wall Street has come to a close, and a new chapter begins. We now know that law enforcement around the country seems far more vigilant about going after those who exercise their right to protest in public spaces than are pursuing the architects of financial calamity. We know there have been more than 4,500 arrests of almost entirely peaceful Occupy protesters around the country, along with untold number of incidents of beatings, pepper spray, and other repressive tactics. And we also know, thanks to a new analysis of Justice Department data by the Transactional Records Access Clearinghouse at Syracuse University, that federal prosecutions for financial institution fraud are at a 20-year low. During that same period of time, we know that federal prosecutions for all crimes more than doubled. So we now know that we live in a country that deploys pepper spray for kids with signs, but looks the other way when our largest financial institutions almost destroy the global economy through recklessness and deception. We now know OWS has become large and powerful enough to provoke a predictable backlash from the 1%, and not just in the figure of billionaire Mayor Michael Bloomberg. Thanks to a memo we obtained, we know that a prominent Washington lobbying firm with strong ties to John Boehner is pitching the bank industry on an $850,000 campaign directed at tarnishing Occupy Wall Street and attacking Democratic candidates who show support for its message. We now know that the 1%'s greatest fear is that Republicans will no longer defend Wall Street companies. We now know, definitively, that the air is coming out of the Herman Cain bubble as he falls back to third in the most recent polls. We don't know if it's because of the 4 women who have accused him of sexual harassment or performances like the following from an interview with the editorial board of the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel.
So you agreed with President Obama on Libya or not?
Okay, Libya. President Obama supported the uprising, correct? President Obama called for the removal of Gaddafi. Just want to make sure we're talking about the same thing before I say, yes, I agreed, I know I didn't agree. I do not agree with the way he handled it for the following reason. No, that's a different one. I got to go back and see. Got all this stuff twirling around in my head. Specifically, what did you ask me? Did I agree or not disagree with Obama? And I would have gone about assessing the situation differently, which might have caused us to end up at the same place. But where I think more could have been done was, what's the nature of the opposition?
We know that memorizing one's briefing book is actually a pretty difficult task. But we also know it takes a special kind of personality to pivot so quickly from having absolutely no idea what you're talking about to offering a strong opinion on same. Thanks also to the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel, we now know that the industrial Chinese city of Guangzhou has a lower infant mortality rate than Milwaukee does. In Guangzhou, 1 in 210 babies under the age of 12 months die, while in Milwaukee it's a staggering 1 in 95. We now know that the combination of austerity and privatization has reached yet another surreal frontier. In Colorado, Jefferson County schools have sold advertising space on the report cards they give to students. We know that ads will run across 2 inches of the bottom of the report cards and tout the state's nonprofit education savings plan, which is a whole lot better than some other products we can imagine being advertised in that space. But we also know the district already has a contract with a local bank for advertising on buses, and we know there's something sick in a society that so squeezes its schools that such commercialization becomes inevitable. We know there's value in society saying certain things are not for sale. So what do my guests now know they didn't know when the week began? We'll find out after this. I want to find out what my guests know that they didn't know when the week began. I'm going to start with you, James Polis of DailyCaller.com.
I now know that Syria is on the brink of war and that informed opinion is sharply divided over whether or not this is going to happen and what the consequences are going to be for the region. I think one thing that we can tell for sure is that whereas it looked like Iran was really rising in the region as a hegemon, it now looks like Iran has been thrown back on its heels with its nuclear scientists being assassinated, with the Dooku virus afflicting its weapons program, and now with its client state Syria looking like it's about to fall to pieces.
I saw a crazy graphic of it. Stopped me in my tracks, and I was going to put it in Now We Know. Maybe I'll put it in tomorrow's show. But of just the amount of civilians killed by the Syrian state since what started as a nonviolent uprising began. I mean, it's just been
triple digits.
Every day after day after day, hundreds and hundreds of people being killed by the state. It's absolutely gruesome what's happening in Syria, and there aren't really cameras in there, so we're not. It seems invisible to us particularly us who work in television. Michelle Goldberg, what do you now know?
I think we now know that enthusiastic support of police action will not protect a journalist from police brutality while covering said action. You know, one of the big stories of Occupy Wall Street has been the incredible crackdown on the press and kind of both keeping the press away from the events, but also arresting journalists after journalists where clearly they're covering it, including roughing up a reporter from the New York Post, which had called for this crackdown on the cover, and then roughing up one of your colleagues at the Daily Caller, who was then kind of picked up and helped by the Occupy Wall Street protesters.
Laura Flanders, what do you now know?
Well, I now know that Melissa is really serious about the Kaine campaign, because she's just weeping watching that press conference. We also know that the mayors of this country can get together and coordinate. 18 of them apparently were talking about how to coordinate their evictions of Occupy Wall Street. Could they please coordinate maybe some action around jobs and housing and environment? What about that?
You're referencing Jean Quan, who's the mayor of Oakland, who gave an interview to the BBC in which she sort of casually mentioned that she was on a conference call with other mayors discussing what those mayors were going to do, and there was a sense that there had been some coordination because these evictions seemed to sort of cascade one after another. She said on the BBC.
Let's coordinate about some other things.
Melissa Harris Perry, what do you now know?
You mean this week?
Yes, this week.
Let me think about that.
You did such a good job. I was like, oh my God, did I ask a bad question? I had this panic attack. That was very good. You sold me on that. You're like, no, that's the wrong one. That's the wrong one.
No, but actually, on the Newt Gingrich rise, I think, for me, I'm such an elections person. I'm just fascinated by what's going on in the GOP right now, and I feel like I'm learning just how powerful the not Mitt vote is. The fact that it keeps landing on one after another in this cycle, and it really just seems to be sort of who will the roulette wheel come around to in Iowa is what it feels like.
My thanks to James Polis of thedailycaller.com, Michelle Goldberg of Newsweek and Daily Beast, Laura Flanders of GritTV.org, and Melissa Harris Perry, MSNBC contributor, Tulane professor, and you will be my guest tomorrow. We're keeping you for another day. Thank you for joining us today for Up. Coming up next is Weekends with Alex Witt. I'll be joining her in just a bit to discuss the story we broke this morning, the proposed Wall Street lobbyist plan to attack Occupy Wall Street. And join us tomorrow, Sunday morning at 8. Melissa Harris Perry will be back, along with Congressman Steve Cohen, who will be on our panel, and Senator Sherrod Brown will respond to our report that he was signaled out by name in the plan to attack Occupy Wall Street. You can find more on that story and keep up with the show at up.msnbc.com. See you tomorrow. Thanks for getting up.